Hi guys! This is the second part of my video on Billy Joel's New York State of Mind and how you can get from simple chords to complex and sophisticated harmony. If you haven't checked out the first part yet, you should definitely do so now. And when you come back, I will finish the second part of the song, the second part of the verse and chorus essentially, in this video. We will again look at the skeleton quickly, which is pretty much the same, but in an interesting way, the same as in the first part. We will see what harmonic rhythm can do. We look at the descending bass line. I quickly mention the double dominant. And a very interesting part I like a lot are deceptive resolutions. You should definitely learn that for your bag of tricks in songwriting and in reharmonizing and making music in general. And finally, we will look at the modulation going on and how Billy Joel uses common chords to make that modulation smooth. So let's go, and I hope there is something to learn for everybody out there. Okay, let's talk about the skeleton of this part of the song first. Again, the skeleton are basically the cornerstone chords of the whole progression. And in this case, it's the same as in the first part. We got C major, A minor, F major. Then it's a little different. We got the D dominant. And then we're moving to G, to the G dominant chord again. So this is basically the same as in the first part of the song. And also the chords that we use to make it smoother or to make it more colorful, the transition between the chords, the preceding dominants, if you remember, are the same as in the first part. So the skeleton basically stays the same. But the interesting part here is that the harmonic rhythm changes. Now, harmonic rhythm is how often chords change. So, in the first part of the song, the chords changed every bar. So we had C for one bar, E dominant for one bar, A minor for one bar. Then we had a 2-5 progression, a little different. Then F for one bar, A for one bar, D minor for one bar, and B flat for one bar. So the chords lasted for one bar, and you had one chord change per bar. Now in the second part, we increase the harmonic rhythm. So we have 2 chord changes per bar. And then it slows down again. So the harmonic rhythm is a very important tool in songwriting. Because increasing the harmonic rhythm also increases tension. It creates interest, it creates some variation, and it also increases tension. So for your own songs, or if you reharmonize songs, be aware of the harmonic rhythm, of how often chord changes occur. Because switching between harmonic rhythms can give your song direction and can create points of interest. And in this case, we increase tension a little by increasing the harmonic rhythm to 2 chord changes per bar. And then in the second part, now we're back to the original harmonic rhythm, just 1 chord per bar. So Billy Joel uses the harmonic rhythm here to create some tension, some forward motion. And then stopping it here, going back to a slow harmonic rhythm, and creating space for the hook. And this hook appears right where you would expect another chord change to appear. So it's a point where you expect to hear something, but you hear something unexpected, because there's no chord change there. The harmonic rhythm slowed down again, and instead you hear the hook. And this lets the hook stand out more. It almost feels like a pause here, like the song pauses. And and then continues with the slower harmonic rhythm. And for your own songs, be aware of harmonic rhythm. Don't let it just happen somehow, but be aware that how often you change chords influences how your song feels. And increasing harmonic rhythm usually increases tension. And switching between harmonic rhythm creates interest in your song. And now let's look at the descending bass line here. Because although the chord changes are basically the same as in the first part of the verse, the bass plays different notes. So we got the C major, and then we got the E dominant chord, but the bass plays the fifth in the bass. Then we got A minor with the root in the bass. Then we got a C chord with the fifth in the bass, F chord, a C chord with the third in the bass, and then the D dominant with the root in the bass. And what this does is it creates a descending bass line, kind of an own melody for the bass. The bass just walks down the C major scale. And this is a nice tool to weave chord changes together. It kind of creates something to hold on to for the listener. And it's also kind of a contrapunct, like a contrapuntal motion. And the bass has its own melody. And using stepwise bass lines, like bass lines moving in seconds, in whole or half steps, either up or down, is always a great tool to make chord progressions more convincing, to weave them together. What you got to keep in mind is that the bass note always has to be part of the chord tone. So in this case, the bass note is either the root, the fifth, or the third. It could also be the seventh, but that's a little different. You gotta take care there that it sounds like you want it to sound. But usually, if the bass plays the third or the fifth, then you can create, in many cases, you can create nice moving bass lines. Also, this progression reminds me a little of the Pachelbel progression. Pachelbel progression is a very famous, very common progression. It's pretty old. And it also works with a descending bass line like that. And it's, you could argue that this is a little Pachelbel progression here. If you don't know the Pachelbel progression, don't worry, it's an advanced topic, but as a songwriter or as a musician who wants to reharmonize, you should check that out. Check out the Pachelbel progression. And to summarize this point, use descending bass lines. You don't have to use them everywhere, but know that this is a nice tool to make chord progressions convincing, to weave them together. And now let's look at the D dominant chord at the end of this descending bass progression. So, I'm gonna adjust the light here. This is a little different than in the first part of the song. If you remember, in the first part, we had a D minor chord here because we wanted it to move to the G dominant chord and back to C. And I said, if you want to precede a dominant chord with another chord, then you would usually not make it a dominant chord, but make it a Dorian chord. So you would use D Dorian, G dominant, and then back to C. The reason was not to take away tension from the original dominant chord. But in this case, it doesn't lead directly to the dominant chord. It leads to a F major chord and then to the G dominant chord and back to C. Or at least you would expect it to go to C. In that case, the preceding dominant can be a D dominant chord that already prepares us for the G dominant chord. So you see, it can also work to have a dominant chord lead to a dominant chord. And in that case, Billy Joel also inserts the F chord to really make the final G chord a dominant sound. It sounds like a dominant. There's no doubt that this could be a tonic. It's definitely a dominant because of the F. We have the classic cadence here, 4, 5, 1 in the key of C major. So there's no problem with having the D dominant there. It doesn't take away any tension from the G dominant chord. And this D dominant chord from the key of G is a special chord in that sense that is used very often. And it has its own name. It's the dominant of the dominant, and the name for that is the double dominant. The double dominant is just the dominant of the dominant, or it's the dominant of the key one step further in the cycle of fifth. So these two keys, C major and G major, are closely related in the circle of fifth. They're right next to each other. Let me point out how Billy Joel goes back from the D dominant, which is in the key of G major, to the key of C major by using the F. And this F is interesting. I would actually interpret it this way. You have the D dominant, and then you just make that dominant chord a minor chord, a Dorian chord. And then go to G and back to C. So then you have a 2-5-1 progression, clearly in the key of C major. And just turning that D dominant chord into a D Dorian chord, it's nice. And you go back to basically turning it into a Dorian chord already brings us back to the key of C major. And why do I talk about D Dorian? Well, because the D chord is the relative minor chord of the F chord. So they are closely related. Almost, they almost got all the same notes. But Billy Joel plays the F chord here. And then you have the typical 4-5-1 cadence in the key of C major. So that was the double dominant here. So before we look at the modulation between adjacent keys, let's look another interesting thing that's happening here. So when we move from the D dominant chord to the F, F and G, as I said, is a typical 4-5 progression in C major, and it wants to lead to the C tonic chord. This is where it wants to lead us. But Billy Joel doesn't give you the tonic chord, the C major chord at the end. Instead, it goes like this. So you get the A minor chord instead. And this is called a deceptive resolution or a deceptive cadence. And a deceptive cadence is simply a cadence or a chord progression that sets you up for a certain chord that you expect to happen, and then disappoint your expectation and just play a different chord. And in this case, instead of playing the C, you would expect plays the A minor. And this is a wonderful tool because it sets up that expectation and then it hits with the A minor, and that creates that wonderful melancholic feel of the song. It's beautiful. But for deceptive resolutions, you could basically pick any chord as long as it's just a chord you didn't expect. And also always keep in mind that the chord you play has to somehow have the melody note in it. Otherwise it would sound strange. So we could also, from a typical 2-5 cadence, we could just move to any chord. It always sounds surprising, and depending on what chord you use, you can create different feelings. I mean, this is kind of pleasant surprise, I would say. But in this case, where Billy Joel moves to a minor chord, so you expect the major, it kind of falls back into that melancholic mood. And now let's continue with the modulation that's going on between keys here. So, The last point I want to point out in this part of the song is how Billy Joel continuously modulates between two keys, between the tonal center of C and the tonal center of G. C major and G major. And you can see that we have that with the double dominant, which is in the key of G. Then we get back to C major with a 4-5-1 progression, Deceptive Resolution to A minor, and then again a D dominant chord, which is again in the key of G major. Of G major. And then moving to A minor and G major chord, which is the tonic in the key of G major, but immediately turning it into a dominant chord in the key of C major and moving back to C major. So you see him moving back and forth between these two keys. And the reason why it is so natural and so easy to move between these two keys is because they are closely related. These two keys are right next to each other in the circle of fifth. And this technique works for any key that is right next to another key in the circle of fifth. Keys that are closely related and next to each other in the circle of fifth also have a lot of common chords. And common chords are one trick for smooth modulation. A common chord is simply a chord that is part of more than one key. So of the two keys we have. In this case, for example, A minor. A minor is part of at least two keys. So we could never tell by playing A minor, is this the tonic of A natural minor, so one chord? Or is this the relative minor of a C major chord in a C major key, so a 6 chord? Or is this a 2 chord in the key of G major? We don't know. We can tell by simply playing the chord. What determines the function of this chord, what it really is it a 1 chord, is it a 6 chord, is this a 2 chord, is the context in which it stands. So the chords that come before and after it. And in this case here, we set it up with a 4-5 cadence in C major, and then hitting that A minor. So it now sounds like, maybe a 6 chord, maybe a 1 chord, depending on how you feel it. So you could feel it as now we're deceptively moving to A minor, and this is a 1 chord, the tonic. Or you could say, well, I still hear that strong C major cadence, and I hear it as a relative minor. But in any case, you hear it, let's say you hear it as a 1 chord in A minor. And then we follow it, or Billy Joel follows it up with a D dominant chord. And this D dominant chord is not part of A minor and not part of C major. He reinterprets the A minor chord as a 2 chord in G major. A 2-5-1 progression in G major. And this is the key to smooth modulation, or this is one technique for creating smooth modulations. It is to take common chords and then reinterpreting their function. So at first, we interpret that A minor chord as a tonic chord. And then, while hitting the D dominant chord, our brain does something very interesting. It kind of goes back in time a little and reinterprets that A minor chord as in the context of G major, as a 2 chord. First we hear it as a 1 chord, and now we suddenly we go back in time and hear it as a 2 chord. And this is interesting how the mind works. And one thing we do as songwriters, as composers, as musicians is play with these psychological tricks on the human mind. And here we interpret the chord in different contexts. And how do you define the context of a chord? Well, it's simple, with cadences, with strong cadences. So we can... So this cadence is the same chord, the A minor in the middle, but one time it plays the role of a 1 chord, and the next time it plays the role of a 2 chord. And because the chord is part of both keys, it's very, very simple to move between the two. And the same technique is repeated then with the G as a tonic chord, and then just reinterpreting that as a dominant chord in the key of C major. And then we can move back to C major very naturally. Remember that for your bag of tricks. Modulating between two adjacent keys, two keys right next to each other in the circle of fifth, is pretty easy. And you usually do it with common chords. So chords that belong to both keys, and you just reinterpret it. You just reinterpret the function of this chord. Yeah, we covered a lot of ground in this video again. Let me summarize this quickly for you. So first we look at the skeleton and the descending chord line. Chords are basically the same, but we have a descending chord line, and we also have an increased harmonic rhythm. And then the harmonic rhythm slows down on the double dominant. We move into a 4/5 progression in the key of C major, which is deceptively resolved to A minor. And then that A minor chord is reinterpreted as a Dorian chord in the key of G major. Then we move to G, which is a tonic in G major, and then reinterpreted as a dominant chord in C major, and back to another round of the verse with a C major. Now I hope that I could help you add some tricks to your bag of tricks as a songwriter, or for reharmonizing songs, for simply making music. Go ahead and pick a topic from this video and try to use it in your own songs. Play around with it, use it. Let me know what you think. If you have questions, let me know. But apart from all this theory, have fun making music and keep writing awesome songs.